History whispers tales of justice served not through the thunder of many guns, but through the lightning of one. In the lawless expanse of Arizona Territory, 1878, they say there lived a woman whose hands could nurture life from barren earth, as skillfully as they could draw iron. Some claim it's just another tall tale born in the heat of desert campfires. But those who witnessed the events that unfolded in Salvation Valley that fateful autumn, they know the truth of what happens when violent men mistake gentleness for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Salvation Valley barely warranted a spot on any map, just another struggling settlement carved from the harsh Arizona Badlands. A single dusty road meandered past weather-beaten homesteads, connecting a modest mercantile, a whitewashed church that had seen better days, and the Coyote's Rest Saloon, the only watering hole for 40 miles in any direction. The land was brutal, unrelenting. But beneath its sun-scorched surface lay something worth dying for: water. Natural springs fed the valley year-round, making it a rare jewel in a desert crown. The kind of place that could make a person prosperous if they knew how to work it, or dead if the wrong people took notice. Sarah Chen Mackenzie, who'd run the mercantile since her Scottish husband passed in 71, remembered the day everything changed with the clarity of a desert morning. It was late spring when the heat hadn't yet turned murderous, and hope still danced on the horizon like a mirage. The store's bell chimed, and in walked a stranger leading a well-kept mule laden with farming implements. She wasn't the sort to draw attention. Average height, practical clothes that had seen honest wear, the kind of face that blended into any crowd. But Sarah hadn't survived 30 years on the frontier by taking things at face value. There was something about this stranger that made her instincts sharpen like a hawk spotting movement in the scrubland. "Name's Catherine Rose," the stranger said, voice soft as desert sand, purchasing supplies with careful consideration. Her hands caught Sarah's attention first. They were strong, sure, but they moved with an unusual grace that seemed at odds with the calluses she'd clearly acquired recently. And her eyes. They had that peculiar way of taking in everything, while appearing to look at nothing, always knowing where every person stood, where every exit lay. Sarah had seen eyes like that before, back when her husband rode with the Arizona Rangers. Rose bought Martinez's abandoned plot on the valley's western edge, the one most folks said was too close to Comanche territory to farm safely. Paid in gold double eagles, kept to herself, and started working that supposedly dangerous land with a precision that made even lifelong farmers pause and watch. Every morning before the sun branded the sky, she'd be out there, methodically clearing rocks, measuring rows with unusual exactness, setting fence posts with the careful attention of a woman marking distances for something far more important than farming. The valley held its share of secrets in those days, and plenty of reasons to keep them. The water in Salvation Valley wasn't just good, it was salvation itself in a territory where drought could spell death. Natural springs that flower year-round were worth more than gold. But that kind of wealth drew attention, and attention was the last thing the valley needed with the Diamondback riders pushing south through the territory. Lucas Sidewinder Reeves had started small, just another outlaw, with a fast gun and bigger dreams. But he was smarter than most and realized that true power wasn't in quick raids and stolen horses, but in controlling the water itself. He'd already taken 3 valleys to the north, using a mixture of intimidation, arson, and lies to convince ranchers to sell their water rights for pennies on the dollar. Those who refused had a habit of vanishing, their homes mysteriously burning on moonless nights. The Mackenzie family knew better than most what Reeves was capable of. Sarah's daughter Isabella had been sheriff in Promise Creek before the Diamondback. Riders moved in. She tried to organize resistance, unite the ranchers against Reeves's pressure. They found her one morning in her own jail cell, shot through both hands before the killing shot, her badge replaced with a diamond back carved from copper, Reeves's signature. Nobody paid much mind to Catherine Rose in those early days. She was just another farmer trying to coax life from stubborn earth. No one noticed how she'd sometimes pause in her work, head cocked just so, like she was listening for something, far beyond normal hearing, or how her eyes would track riders passing on the road with the same careful attention she gave to plotting her furrows. Even when she came to town for supplies, she moved quietly as a shadow, watching, listening, and learning the valley's rhythms. Young Michael Chen Mackenzie, Sarah's 12-year-old grandson, was probably the first to suspect something wasn't quite what it seemed with the new farmer. Michael was sharp as a cactus spine and twice as curious, had taken to watching Rose's farm from the hills above, fascinated by the stranger's methodical ways. One morning he saw something that set his mind spinning. Rose was mending a fence when a diamondback rattler struck at her from the rocks. Without seeming to look, without even changing expression, Rose's hand moved. The snake fell dead, its head nearly severed by a thrown fence staple. It was the kind of move that shouldn't have been possible, too fast, too precise, like her hand knew where it needed to be before her mind gave the command. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, you need to understand what Salvation Valley was before the storm broke. Before a single farmer showed the whole territory that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't the gun a person carries openly, but the skill they keep hidden behind quiet words and honest work. You need to understand what it means when a woman who spent her life perfecting the art of the draw decides instead to pursue the art of making things grow, and what happens when violent men mistake that choice for weakness. As spring burned into summer, dark clouds gathered over Salvation Valley, though not a drop of rain fell from the Arizona sky. Word of the Diamondback riders' approach spread through the settlement like wildfire in drought season. They started subtle, the way a rattler tests its ground before striking. First came the scouts, just passing through, they said, asking casual questions about water rights and property boundaries. They'd stop at the Coyotes' Rest, loose with their money and freer with their threats, bragging about what happened to folks down north who didn't know how to be reasonable. Sheriff Marcus Torres watched it all from his office, worrying, etching deeper lines around his eyes. He was a good man, folks said, but good wasn't always enough against the kind of evil riding toward their valley. He'd known Isabella Mackenzie, seen what happened when a lawwoman stood alone against Reeves's pack. His badge felt heavier with each passing day, like it was cast from lead instead of tin. The first real trouble came at Davidson Place. Rachel. Davidson was a proud woman, worked her spread for 12 years, and raised 3 children on that land. One morning she found her irrigation channel blocked, the precious water diverted away from her crops. When she went to clear it, 3 riders appeared, casual as you please, guns riding low on their hips. Shame about the water, one said, cleaning his nails with a knife. Lot of accidents happening lately. Of course, Mr. Reeves is offering fair prices for water rights. Better to sell than watch everything you built just dry up and blow away. Davidson had no choice. She sold for a quarter of what the water rights were worth, packed her family in their wagon, and headed east. Others followed. The Turners, the Rodriguez family with their prized horses, the Clayton family, and their alfalfa fields. Each sale came with a story of accidents that couldn't be proven, of midnight visits and morning devastation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Through it all, Catherine Rose kept working her plot on the western edge, seemingly absorbed in her endless task of clearing fields and tending crops. But Sarah Chen Mackenzie noticed how her hands would tighten on her tools when Reeves's men rode past, like they were something else entirely. She caught her one evening as she was buying supplies, her usual order of seeds and tools. "Have you heard about the Davidsons?" Sarah asked, measuring out coffee beans with practiced precision. "Hard not to," Rose replied, her voice soft as ever, but with something underneath it, like steel wrapped in silk. "Reeves's men were in here earlier, asking about you. About your water rights. Rose's smile didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Were they now? And what did you tell them, Mrs. Mackenzie? That you're just another fool trying to farm Comanche territory. She paused, then added lower, But you're not, are you? For a long moment, Rose said nothing, just studied her with those two sharp eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes, Mrs. Mackenzie, the best way to protect something isn't to fight for it, but to grow it, to nurture it until it's strong enough to stand on its own. That night, young Michael Mackenzie couldn't sleep. He snuck out to his watching spot in the hills above Rose's farm, hoping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious farmer's strange abilities. What he saw would stay with him for years to come. Rose wasn't farming, she was practicing. In the pale moonlight, her hands would occasionally drift to her hip where no gun hung, moving with a fluid grace that made Michael's breath catch. Every motion was precise, deliberate, like a dance learned so well it had become part of her. When a coyote's howl split the night, Rose's hand moved faster than Michael's eyes could follow, drawing and firing an imaginary gun in one smooth motion. The boy had seen plenty of gunslingers pass through Salvation Valley, but none moved like that. This was something else entirely, the kind of speed that turned legend into truth. Michael ran home through the darkness, his mind racing with what he'd seen, but by morning, everything had changed. The Reynolds family's well had been poisoned, their cattle dying of thirst. Reeves's men were getting bolder, and Salvation Valley's time was running out. Sheriff Torres called a town meeting in the church the next day. Reeves isn't just coming for water rights anymore, he announced to the gathered faces. Word is he's aiming to make an example of us, show the whole territory what happens to folks who take too long to see things his way. Catherine Rose stood at the back of the church, quiet as always, but Sarah noticed how her eyes tracked every reaction, every whispered conversation. She was measuring something, Sarah realized, not distances this time, but resolve. The meeting ended with more questions than answers, but as the townspeople filed out, Sarah caught Rose's arm. There's something else you're not telling us, she said. Something about why you really came here. Rose studied her for a long moment. Been following Reeves's pattern for a while now, she finally admitted. Valley to valley, always the same. But this time, she looked out toward her farm, where the evening sun painted the fields gold. This time, he's riding into more than he knows. Sarah's breath caught as realization dawned. You chose this valley on purpose. You were waiting for him. Rose's smile held no humor. Sometimes, Mrs. Mackenzie, the best trap is the one your enemy walks into thinking it's his own idea. As darkness fell over Salvation Valley, more riders were spotted heading south. The Diamondback riders were coming in force, and Lucas Sidewinder Reeves himself was leading them. What none of them knew was that a quiet farmer with calloused hands and a gunfighter's grace had been preparing for their arrival longer than anyone suspected. The war for Salvation Valley was about to begin, though not in the way anyone expected. Not even Reeves, with all his cunning, could have guessed that his greatest enemy would turn out to be a woman who had traded her gun belt for a plow, or at least appeared to. Lucas Sidewinder. Reeves rode into Salvation Valley at sunset 3 days after the Reynolds well was poisoned. He didn't arrive with guns blazing or a show of force. Instead, he came like a businessman, well-dressed in an elegant black coat, a silver Diamondback pin on his lapel, with just 8 riders flanking him. But there was nothing civilized about the fear that rippled through town at his approach, or the way his eyes seemed to measure everything and everyone in terms of profit and pain. Sarah Chen Mackenzie watched from her store window as Reeves dismounted outside the Coyote's Rest. He moved with the coiled readiness of a snake preparing to strike, his gun belt worn high and tight in the Mexican style. Not a showman's rig, but a killer's tool. The copper Diamondback medallion he wore caught the dying sunlight, a reminder of the fate that had befallen her daughter. Quite the welcome, Reeves remarked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. The Texas drawl in his words did nothing to soften their edge. You'd think folks had never seen honest businessmen looking to invest in their community before. The laugh that followed held no warmth, like wind through a boneyard. Sheriff Torres emerged from his office, badge gleaming but his hand notably away from his gun. Smart man. Reeves's riders had already spread out, taking positions that gave them clear lines of fire across the street. Mr. Reeves, Torres said, his voice steady despite the tension. We weren't expecting you. Best kind of visit, wouldn't you say? Reeves's smile never reached his eyes. Keeps things honest. I hear you've got some of the finest water rights in the territory. Shame to see them worked by folks who don't have the resources to make the most of them. The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine Rose, driving her mule-drawn wagon loaded with farming supplies. She seemed oblivious to the tension, to the way Reeves's men had their hands near their guns. She simply guided her wagon through the crowd, nodding politely to those she passed. Reeves's attention snapped to the newcomer like a rattler sensing movement. Don't believe we've met, he called out. Lucas Reeves at your service. I'm looking to invest in local water rights, build something special here in Salvation Valley. Rose secured her mule before turning, her movements unhurried. Catherine. Rose, she replied simply. Just a farmer trying to grow something worthwhile. But Sarah, watching from her doorway, saw how she positioned herself, subtle, almost unconscious, but putting her in perfect view of all Reeves's men while keeping the setting sun at her back. It was the kind of positioning she'd seen gunfighters use, though most weren't nearly as subtle about it. Farmer? Reeves's eyes narrowed slightly. Heard about your place up west. Comanche territory, bad water. Can't be easy making a living out there. Good things rarely come easy, Mr. Reeves. Rose's voice remained mild, but something in her tone made Reeves's closest rider shift uneasily in his saddle. True enough, but life's full of opportunities if you know where to look. My associates and I might be interested in taking that burden off your hands. Fair price, of course. Rose seemed to consider this, head tilted slightly, as if listening to distant music. Appreciate the offer, she said finally, but I've put down roots. Hard thing to do in rocky soil. Makes you reluctant to pull them up. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Reeves's smile became a razor's edge. Roots can wither mighty quick in this climate. Seen it happen too many times. Man's better off taking a fair offer while it's on the table. Maybe. Rose began unloading her supplies, her movements precise and measured. But I've always believed that anything worth having is worth fighting for, whether it's crops pushing through stone or people standing their ground. Before Reeves could respond, commotion erupted from the north end of town. A rider was coming in fast, one of Reeves's scouts, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He dismounted in a rush, whispering urgently in his boss's ear. Whatever news he brought caused Reeves's face to darken like a thunderhead. We'll continue this discussion later, Reeves said, his casual tone belied by the tension in his shoulders. He turned to Torres. Sheriff, you might want to ride out to Miller Place. Seems there's been another unfortunate accident. As Reeves and his men rode north, Sarah hurried to where Rose still stood calmly unloading her wagon. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, she said quietly, or the biggest fool. Rose's hands never paused in their work. There's a third option, Mrs. Mackenzie. Her voice was soft, meant for Sarah's ears alone. Sometimes a person chooses their ground carefully, knowing exactly what's coming and how to meet it. Young Michael, who had been watching everything from his perch on the store's porch, suddenly spoke up. I saw you last night, Miss Rose. Saw how you move when you think no one's watching. Saw you practicing. Rose turned to the boy, something like sadness crossing her features. And what exactly did you see, Michael? Those weren't farming moves. Michael's voice dropped to a whisper. The way your hand moves to your hip, the way you stand. My aunt used to move like that before the... Diamondback's got her. You're a gunfighter. Smart boy, Rose nodded. Too smart to go spreading stories, I hope. At least until the right time. Sarah grabbed her grandson's shoulder protectively. What are you really, Miss Rose? Rose secured the last of her supplies before answering. Just a woman who learned long ago that there are two ways to deal with snakes. You can hunt them, track them, try to kill them one by one, or you can build something they can't poison, gather good people together, make a stand that matters. She touched the brim of her hat. Good day, Mrs. Mackenzie, Michael. Sheriff Torres approached as Rose's wagon headed west, his face grim. Miller Place is burning, he said without preamble. Old man Miller tried to stand up to them. He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah's hand went to her throat, where she kept her daughter's spare badge on a chain. Marcus, she said, using the sheriff's first name for the first time in years. What are we going to do? Torres watched Rose's wagon disappearing toward the western edge of the valley. Maybe nothing, he said thoughtfully. That new farmer. Of yours. Something familiar about her. Way she moves, the way she takes in everything. Reminds me of stories I heard during the Apache Wars about a gunfighter. Never knew their real name, but they called her Swift Hand Rose because of how fast she could draw. They say she once took down 8 men in the time it takes to blink. You think our farmer is this Swift Hand? I think Reeves just picked a fight without knowing who he's really fighting. And I think things in Salvation Valley are about to get real interesting. As if to punctuate his words, a sound rang out from the western edge of the valley. Not a gunshot, but the clear ring of a hammer striking metal. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a measurement of things to come. The war for Salvation Valley was about to begin, though not in the way anyone expected. Not even Reeves, with all his reputation for cunning, could have guessed that his greatest enemy would turn out to be a woman who seemed to spend more time checking her crops than her gun. But then that's what happens when you mistake a rattlesnake hunter for prey. The next day dawned blood red over Salvation Valley, the sun struggling through dust kicked up by more riders arriving through the night. Reeves's message couldn't have been clearer: resist and burn. But something else was happening in the valley, something that made even his hardened gunmen nervous. It started with the accidents, small things at first, easy to dismiss. 2 of Reeves's men were scouting near Rose's farm when their horses suddenly spooked, throwing them hard enough to crack ribs. They swore they'd heard nothing, seen nothing, just a flash of metal from the distant rocks that had startled their mounts. Another rider, carrying threats to reluctant farmers, found his path blocked by fallen cactus and suspicious rock slides. Each obstacle seemed random, natural even, but they all had one thing in common. They'd been prepared days in advance, just waiting for the right moment. Sarah Chen Mackenzie was counting inventory when Rose came in for her weekly supplies. Her list had changed. Less seed and farming tools, more rope, wire, and oddly specific amounts of mining supplies. Planning on doing some blasting? Sarah asked casually, wrapping the packages. Lot of rock still in that field of yours? Something like that. Rose smiled, but her eyes were focused elsewhere, watching Reeves's latest recruits drinking across the street at the Coyote's Rest. Though sometimes the best way to move a boulder isn't to break it, but to make it roll where you want it to go. Before Sarah could respond, Michael burst into the store, out of breath and wide-eyed. Miss Rose. They're saying Jacob Reeves is coming, Lucas's brother, the one they call the Diamondback's Fang. They say he's even faster with a gun than his brother. Rose's reaction was subtle, just a slight tightening around her eyes. But Sarah caught it. Jacob. Reeves, she said softly. Now that's interesting timing. Do you know of him? Sarah asked, though something in Rose's tone suggested more than mere knowledge. We've met. Rose's hand unconsciously touched her left shoulder, where Sarah glimpsed the edge of an old scar through her worn shirt. 4 years ago, down in the Mexico territories. He was terrorizing mining towns there too until someone stopped him. Someone? Michael leaned in, hungry for details. A ghost, they said. a gunfighter who could draw and fire before most men could blink. Never saw her coming, just heard the explosion of gunpowder and watched their best guns fall. Rose's voice had changed, become distant, like she was reading from a memory. Jacob lost the use of his gun hand that day, and his taste for fair fights started sending others to do his killing for him. Sarah's mind was racing, connecting pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was solving. That's why you chose this valley, isn't it? Why did you spend months preparing your farm? You knew they were coming. Rose nodded slowly. Been tracking the Reeves brothers for 3 years, watching their pattern. They always move the same way. Start with the outer settlements, work their way to the richest water sources. Salvation Valley was next on their list. Just had to wait. Wait for what? Michael asked. For them to think they had the upper hand. For them to get careless. As, if on cue, shouting erupted from the street. 2 of Reeves's men were roughing up old man Turner, whose cattle had mysteriously survived the poisoned well. Turner's daughter Hannah came running to help, only to be pistol-whipped to the ground. Sheriff Torres emerged from his office, but Reeves's other men had him covered. Rose didn't move, didn't even seem to be watching, but her voice carried an edge Sarah hadn't heard before. Michael, remember that cave where you've been watching my farm? The one with the lightning-split mesquite? Michael nodded eagerly. There's a package there, wrapped in oilcloth. Bring it to your grandmother after dark and, Michael. Rose's eyes locked with the boys. Don't let anyone see you. As darkness fell, Michael returned with a heavy bundle. Inside, Sarah found a gun belt unlike any she'd seen before. The holster was worn smooth as silk, custom fitted for a specific weapon, but it was the gun itself that took her breath away. A Colt single-action army, its blued steel dark as night, modified with a smoothness that spoke of a master gunsmith's touch. There was also a letter written in Rose's precise hand. S. Mackenzie. What's coming isn't just about stopping the Reeves brothers. It's about showing good people they can stand against evil. That fear isn't the only way. I've spent months preparing this valley, escape routes, defensive positions, places where one gun can stop 20 men. But a gun's just a tool. What matters is the hands it falls into and the hearts of the people it protects. The sheriff's a good man, but he needs to know he's not standing alone. Show him this gun, show him there's a plan, and when the time comes, show him there are still people willing to fight for what's right. The next morning, Jacob Reeves rode into Salvation Valley with 15 hard men at his back. He was easy to spot, right hand twisted into a useless claw, face carved with hate. His first stop was Rose's farm, but he found only empty fields and carefully tended rows. No sign of the farmer, though the morning coffee pot was still warm on the stove. Jacob didn't like it. Something about the setup felt familiar, tickling old memories he'd rather forget. The precise arrangement of the buildings, the clear lines of sight to every approach. He'd seen work like this before, paid for it with his gun hand. Spread out, he ordered his men. Check every building, every field. Find her. That's when the first shot rang out. The shot that rang out across Salvation Valley didn't kill anyone, wasn't meant to. Instead, the bullet kicked up dust exactly 1 inch from Jacob Reeves's boots, spraying his polished leather with desert sand. The message was crystal clear. The next one wouldn't miss. The Diamondback's fang stood frozen, his crippled hand clutching reflexively at his gun belt as 2 more shots cracked out in rapid succession, each kicking up dirt closer than the last. His men were already diving for cover, but Rose had spent months preparing this battlefield. Every natural hiding spot had been subtly altered. Boulders that appeared solid were carefully balanced to shift under weight. Clusters of cacti had been trimmed to offer less protection than they seemed to promise. And even the innocent-looking irrigation ditches had been dug at angles that would force men to expose themselves to fire. Scatter! Jacob bellowed, but that's exactly what Rose had been waiting for. As the riders broke in different directions, more shots rang out. Not just from one position, but from multiple points around the farm. Some were simple mechanical tricks, carefully placed rifles with triggers set to trip wires, but each shot was precisely aimed to drive Reeves's men exactly where Rose wanted them. In town, Lucas Reeves burst out of the Coyote's rest at the sound of gunfire, his own men scrambling to mount up, but Sheriff Torres was waiting in his office doorway, badge gleaming, Rose's modified Colt hanging low on his hip. "Wouldn't do that if I were you," he said calmly. Behind him stood a dozen townspeople, armed and determined. Sarah Chen Mackenzie's voice rang out from her store's upper window, where she held her daughter's old Winchester with practiced ease. "You've got enough trouble at your brother's position," she called down. "Might want to think carefully about opening a second front." Reeves's face darkened with rage. "You really think a few farmers with rusty rifles can stop me? I own 4 valleys north of here, and every man in them knows what happens to those who stand against the Diamondback Riders." "You own nothing," came a new voice. Rachel Davidson stepped forward, her face still showing the strain of losing her land. "You steal, you poison, you murder, but you don't own anything except fear. And we're done being afraid." Back at Rose's farm, Jacob Reeves and his remaining men had been herded into a natural basin between 2 rock formations. Every time they tried to break out, precise shots would drive them back, not killing shots, something worse. Shots that proved the shooter could end them anytime they wanted, was choosing not to just to prove their control. "Show yourself," Jacob screamed, firing wildly at the surrounding rocks, his twisted hand making his aim erratic. "Face me like a woman, like you faced those miners?" Rose's voice carried clearly across the morning air, though no one could spot her position. "Like you faced their families when you poisoned their wells?" Another shot cracked out, taking Jacob's hat clean off his head. The Diamondback's fang dropped to his knees, his gun falling from trembling fingers. "We can deal," he shouted. "Whatever you want. Money, land, name it." "What I want," Rose's voice was closer now, though still hidden, "is for you to carry a message to every other snake thinking of slithering into this territory. Tell them about today. Tell them what happened when you thought you found easy prey, and instead found a hunter." In town, Lucas Reeves was quickly running out of options. More townspeople were emerging from their homes, armed and purposeful. He recognized faces, men and women whose water rights he'd stolen, whose lives he'd ruined in other valleys. They'd followed him here, drawn by word of Rose's stand, ready to reclaim what was taken. "This is bigger than one valley now," Sheriff Torres said quietly. "Word spread about what's happening here. Every community you terrorized, every family you drove out, they're all watching, all waiting to see if one town can break the Diamondback's grip." Reeves's hand twitched toward his gun. "Are you really ready to die for this worthless dirt?" "No one's dying today." The voice rang out clear as a church bell. Catherine Rose stood in the middle of the street, 30 paces from Reeves. No one had seen her move into position, hadn't heard a sound, like a ghost. The farmer's clothes were dusty from the morning's work, but she stood with a stillness that made every gunman on the street hold their breath. This wasn't the humble farmer who'd spent months tending her crops. This was Swift Hand Rose, the fastest gun in the territory, the woman who'd put down Jacob Reeves in the Mexico territories. "No one's dying," Rose repeated, her voice soft but carrying to every ear. "Unless you make it necessary." For the first time, real fear shone in Lucas Reeves's eyes. Rose's stance, her voice, the way her right hand hung relaxed at her side. This was no farmer playing at resistance. This was a predator who had lured her prey exactly where she wanted them. "Last chance," Rose continued. "Ride out, leave the territory. Never come back, or find out why they called me Swift Hand." Reeves looked around wildly at the armed townspeople, at his brother's men trapped in the distance, at the mysterious gunfighter who had orchestrated it all. His empire of fear was crumbling, and he knew it. At that moment, Lucas Sidewinder Reeves made his final mistake. He drew. What happened next became legend in Salvation Valley. Those who saw it swore Rose never seemed to move, never seemed to Aim. There was just the explosion of her Colt and Reeves's gun flying from his hand, a perfect shot that left him alive but ended any threat he posed. In the distance, similar shots rang out, disarming the remainder of his men with surgical precision. The war for Salvation Valley was over, ending not with a massacre, but with a demonstration of such skill that it left no doubt about what could have happened if Rose had chosen to kill, rather than warn. Michael Chen Mackenzie, watching from his mother's store, saw something else in that moment. Saw the way Rose's hand moved faster than human eyes could follow. It wasn't just speed, though. That was remarkable enough. It was the perfect fusion of mind and muscle, of preparation and execution. Every motion had been planned months in advance, every angle calculated, every possible reaction accounted for. As Reeves's men were rounded up, Sarah approached Rose. "You could have ended this the day you arrived," she said. "Why the wait? Why—" "All the preparation?" Rose holstered her Colt with the same careful precision she used when planting seeds. "Because some things need to grow," she said, looking out over the valley where her crops were starting to show green. "Take root. Become stronger than any one person." As if to prove her point, wagons were already rolling into Salvation Valley, families returning. The Davidsons, the Turners, all those who'd been driven out. But they weren't alone. With them came others, drawn by the story of how one small valley had broken the back of the territory's most feared outlaws. Sheriff Torres found Rose later that day, as the afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold. "Finally remembered where I'd heard about Swift Hand," he said, settling on Rose's fence. "Army records from the Apache Wars. They say you could have written your own ticket. Any marshal's badge, any railroad security job, you name it." Rose nodded slowly. "They offered good money, important work. But I'd seen enough killing by then. Seen what violence does to both sides of any fight. Started thinking maybe the best way to stop evil isn't just to shoot it, but to give good people the courage to stand against it." She gestured at the carefully tended fields, the precise arrangements that had turned a humble farm into a tactical masterpiece. "Farming teaches you patience, shows you that the most important victories are the ones that take time to grow. I needed Reeves to see me as harmless, needed time to prepare the ground, both literally and figuratively. But more than that, I needed the valley to remember its own strength." Young Hannah Turner came running up, excitement written across her face. "Miss Rose!" They found Reeves's ledgers in his saddlebags, all the proof of their crimes, every poisoned, well, every stolen water right. The territorial judges are riding in tomorrow to start setting things right. Rose's smile deepened. "Justice grows best in fertile soil, Hannah. Remember that." As weeks passed, Salvation Valley began to transform. The returning families brought new energy, new determination. Rose's farm became a gathering place, not just for those wanting to learn about agriculture, but for anyone seeking to understand how one woman's patient courage had changed everything. Late one evening, as the desert wind painted the valley with the scent of sage and promise, Sarah finally asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Why here? Of all the places the Reeves brothers terrorized, why choose Salvation Valley to make your stand?" Rose was silent for a long moment, cleaning her Colt with the same care she showed her farming tools. "During the Apache Wars," she said finally, "I learned that the best position for a gunfighter isn't always the highest ground. It's the place where everything comes together: terrain, timing, purpose. Salvation Valley wasn't just another target for the Diamondback Riders. It was the keystone of their empire. Taking it would have given them control of all the surrounding water sources." She paused, checking her gun's action with practiced precision. "But it was more than that. This valley, it's like the land itself wants to grow something good. The water, the soil, the people. Now we plant different seeds." Rose stood, looking out over her fields where the evening light painted everything in shades of promise. Seeds of justice, of community, of standing together against whatever darkness comes. The Reeves brothers won't be the last snakes to eye this territory, but next time they won't find scattered prey. They'll find shepherds who know how to protect their own. As if to prove her words, the valley continued to flourish. The territorial governor, impressed by how one community had broken the Diamondback Riders' grip, established a regional marshal's office in Salvation Valley. Torres took the position, with Rose quietly teaching him and his deputies the arts of patience and preparation that had proven so effective. But Rose herself refused all offers of badges or official positions. She had her farm to tend, she said, and sometimes the best way to protect something wasn't from a position of authority, but from the ground up, nurturing it like a tender shoot until it grew strong enough to weather any storm. Winter came early to Salvation Valley that year, bringing with it whispers of trouble from the north. The Reeves brothers were gone, but nature abhors a vacuum, and other predators had taken notice of how one small valley had brought down an empire. Among them was William Blackhand Henderson, a man who'd made his fortune in the California. Goldfields through means that made even the Diamondback Riders look gentle. Word reached Rose one bitter morning as she was checking her winter wheat. Marshal Torres, still adjusting to his new badge, rode up with news that made the veteran gunfighter's eyes narrow. Henderson's men have been asking questions in thunder. Gap, Torres reported, his breath frosting in the cold air. About you specifically. About what really happened here. Rose continued her inspection, though Sarah, watching from her store porch, noticed how her movements had changed, becoming more measured, more precise. The farmer was fading, the gunfighter emerging once again. Interesting timing, Rose mused, studying a wheat sprout with careful attention. Just as the mountain passes is about to close with snow. That's not all. Torres hesitated, then pressed on. They say he's bringing something new, Gatling guns, 2 of them. This got Rose's full attention. The rapid-fire weapons could change everything, making her carefully prepared defensive positions worthless. But there was something in her eyes, not fear, but the calm calculation that had served her so well before. You know what most men don't understand about machines like that, Marcus? Rose asked, examining another wheat sprout with careful attention. They think more bullets means more power. But a Gatling gun is just like any other weapon. It's only as good as its position, its timing, and the person using it. Sarah approached, her face tight with worry. Even you can't outshoot a Gatling gun, Catherine. No, Rose agreed. But I don't have to. Sometimes the best way to defeat a weapon isn't to fight it, but to make it useless. She turned to Torres. Ride up to the old mission ruins behind the burnt chapel. You'll find a cache of supplies I laid in months ago. Bring back the brass spyglass and the mining maps. As Torres rode off, Sarah confronted Rose directly. You knew something like this would happen, didn't you? Even after the Reeves brothers, you kept preparing. Rose's smile held no humor. Peace is like farming, Mrs. Mackenzie. You don't just plant once and expect crops forever. You have to tend it, protect it, and be ready for the storms that come. She looked north toward the mountain passes. Henderson's not like Reeves. He doesn't want to own the valley, he wants to destroy it. Make an example of what happens to those who resist men like him. That evening, Marshal Torres called a town meeting in the church. The community that gathered was different from the frightened settlers of 6 months ago. These were people who had stood against terror and won, who had learned that courage, like fear, could spread if given fertile ground. Henderson's coming, Torres announced simply. And he's coming for blood. Those Gatling guns can tear this town apart. Then we stand again, Rachel Davidson declared, her voice firm. Miss Rose showed us how last time. But Rose, standing quietly, at the back of the church, shook her head. Not like last time. This needs to be different. Henderson's expecting a gunfighter's tricks, expecting me to try to pick off his men from hiding. Her eyes held that distant look, that meant she was seeing things others couldn't. Michael, who had stuck close to Rose since the Reeves incident, studying her methods with fierce dedication, was the first to notice what she was really doing. Looking out from the church window at the seemingly random construction projects Rose had started around the valley, he suddenly understood. "You're not building barriers," he realized, watching her sight along a timber line. "You're building something else entirely." "Henderson thinks he knows what he's facing," Rose replied quietly. "Thinks he's learned from Reeves's mistakes. But there's an old saying among gunfighters, the target you see isn't always the target that matters." As the first snow began to fall, Salvation Valley prepared for war once again, but this time under Rose's guidance. They were preparing for a very different kind of fight. Swift hand. Rose had one more lesson to teach about the nature of patience, preparation, and the true meaning of strength. And in the frozen passes to the north, Black Hand, Henderson was about to learn why some legends are best left undisturbed. 3 days of snowfall transformed Salvation Valley into something otherworldly, a landscape of white broken only by the dark shapes of Rose's mysterious constructions. To untrained eyes, they looked like madness, wooden frames and stone piles arranged in patterns that made no obvious sense. But Sarah Chen Mackenzie had learned to see beyond the obvious where Catherine Rose was concerned. She found her at dawn checking measurements with the brass spyglass Torres had retrieved. The instrument wasn't a military issue. It was something else, something more precise. Like everything about Rose, it had a purpose beyond the obvious. "That's not just for spotting, is it?" Sarah asked, offering her coffee. Rose adjusted the spyglass settings with practiced care. "It's a surveyor's transit. Spent 3 years with the railroad learning how to map terrain, calculate grades and angles." She smiled slightly. "Useful? Skills for a gunfighter. Even more useful for what's coming." "And what exactly is coming?" The question came from Marshal Torres, approaching through the knee-deep snow. "Because right now, all I see is a lot of timber and stone placed where it won't stop a single bullet from those Gatling guns. That's because they're not meant to stop bullets." Rose's voice held that quiet certainty that had come to mean trouble for her enemies. "They're meant to direct them. Every frame, every stone pile. They're like the banks of a river, channeling water where you want it to go." Understanding dawned in Torres's eyes. "You're creating killing grounds." "No." Rose's denial was sharp. "I'm creating choice points. Places where Henderson and his men will have to make decisions. And in weather like this, with limited visibility..." She gestured at the swirling snow. "They'll make the choices I want them to make." The day brought more preparations, but not the kind anyone expected. Instead of digging defensive positions, Rose had the townspeople spread hay and straw in specific places, creating paths that looked like natural routes through the snow. Each path led past her wooden constructions, past piles of stone that seemed randomly placed. Michael, watching from his favorite observation point, began to see the pattern. "It's like a maze," he said excitedly, "but one you can't see until you're in it." "Smart boy." Rose nodded approvingly. "In a snowstorm, men follow the path of least resistance. They'll take what looks like natural cover, move along the easiest routes. And those routes lead right where you want them," Michael finished. "But what about the Gatling guns?" Sarah asked, joining them. Rose's smile held a predator's edge. "A Gatling gun is just a complicated way of throwing lead, and like anything complicated, it has weaknesses. Weight, limited mobility in deep snow, fixed firing positions, but its biggest weakness..." She pointed to the heavy clouds gathering over the mountains. "Visibility. A Gatling gun is useless if you can't see what you're shooting at." That afternoon, Henderson's scouts were spotted checking the passes. They were careful, professional, but they saw exactly what Rose wanted them to see. A town preparing typical defenses, seemingly aware of the devastating power of rapid-fire weapons. "Let them look," Rose instructed when some of the townspeople wanted to drive the scouts off. "Let them think they know what they're facing." Sarah found her that evening in her barn, methodically checking her Colt. But she was also preparing something else. Small metal canisters with carefully measured fuses. Mining charges? Sarah asked, surprised. Sometimes, Rose replied, working the action of her revolver with practiced smoothness. The best trap isn't the one you set, but the one your enemy sets for himself. Every man has patterns, habits. Henderson's known for using Gatling guns to pin down his targets while his men move in for the kill. He'll expect us to hunker down, try to weather the storm of bullets. But that's not your plan. A gunfighter's greatest asset isn't her speed. Rose held up one of the metal canisters, studying it in the lamplight. It's her ability to control the battlefield, to shape it, to know every angle, every distance, every choice her opponent will face. As night fell, more news arrived. Henderson's main force was moving through the passes, using the storm for cover. They had the Gatling guns hauled on specially designed sleds, but they also had something else, something that made Rose's eyes narrow when she heard about it. Explosive shells, Michael reported breathlessly. For the Gatling guns. They're saying Henderson plans to make an example of Salvation Valley, not just defeat us, destroy us completely. Rose absorbed this information with her usual calm, but those who knew her saw the subtle changes, the way she checked her gear with extra care, the stillness that came over her, not of fear, but of a predator preparing to strike. "Good," she said finally, surprising everyone. "Let them bring their explosives. Sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy brings to the fight." That night, as the storm intensified, Rose gathered the town's defenders in the church. The plan she laid out was unlike anything they expected. No heroic last stands, no dramatic gunfights from distant ridges. Instead, she spoke of timing, of pressure points, of how fear and limited visibility could turn a superior force's strength against itself. "Tomorrow," she concluded, "Henderson will learn what Reeves learned, that Salvation Valley isn't just land worth fighting for. It's land worth thinking for, ground worth planning for, and most importantly," her eyes met each defender in turn, "it's home to people worth protecting by any means necessary." As the defenders dispersed to their positions, Sarah caught Rose's arm. "You're not telling us everything, are you? There's more to your plan." "There always is, Mrs. Mackenzie." Rose checked the chambers of her Colt one final time. "But sometimes the best plan is the one your own people can't reveal even under pressure." The night deepened, the storm howling like a pack of wolves scenting blood. Somewhere in that swirling, white darkness, Henderson's forces were moving into position, confident in their superior firepower and explosive arsenal. But they were moving into a battlefield shaped by a master of angles and distances, a woman who had spent months preparing for this moment. Dawn never really came to Salvation Valley that morning, just a gradual lightening of the storm's darkness, to a ghostly gray. The snow fell in thick curtains, reducing visibility to mere yards, transforming familiar shapes into looming shadows. Perfect weather for an attack, most would say, but Rose had been counting on exactly this kind of day. The first sign of Henderson's advance came as a deep rumbling through the frozen ground, the sound of heavy sleds carrying the Gatling guns. Through the swirling snow, dark figures emerged, moving exactly as Rose had predicted, following the paths of least resistance that she'd so carefully prepared. "Right on schedule," Rose murmured from her position near the church steeple. She wasn't using her spyglass in this weather. Eyes alone worked better. Besides, she'd memorized every distance, every angle months ago. "Michael, signal the North Ridge." Young Mackenzie raised a lantern 3 times, its light diffused by the snow into a ghostly glow. Moments later, an answering flash came from where Rachel Davidson and her people waited. Everything was in position. Henderson's men moved with professional precision, securing what looked like advantageous positions among Rose's wooden constructions. The Gatling guns were placed exactly where any military commander would put them, on slight rises offering clear fields of fire toward the town, or what seemed like clear fields. "They're deploying the explosive shells," Michael reported, watching through a gap in the steeple boards. 4 men to each gun, just like you said they would. Rose nodded, checking her Colt one last time. Confident men make predictable choices. Henderson thinks he's learned from Reeves's mistake and thinks overwhelming firepower is the answer to a skilled gunfighter. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. He hasn't learned the right lesson. The attack began with theatrical flourish. William Blackhand. Henderson himself rode forward through the snow, his signature black duster stark against the white landscape. His voice boomed across the valley, practiced and pompous. To the people of Salvation Valley, you've earned a reputation for resistance, for harboring a woman who thinks herself clever enough to stand against progress. I'm here to teach you the cost of such pride. As if to punctuate his words, both Gatling guns opened fire, their savage drumbeat echoing. Off the mountains, hundreds of explosive shells chewed through the snow, detonating against wood and stone. But Rose's careful preparations proved their worth. Most of the explosions were caught by hidden earthworks or deflected by precisely angled timber frames. Time. To introduce some variables, Rose said calmly. She fired a single shot, not at any person, but at a specific stone pile on the valley's eastern edge. The impact dislodged a carefully balanced rock, which tumbled down, triggering a cascade. The resulting avalanche wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. The thundering snow and rock sent Henderson's men scrambling for new cover, exactly the positions Rose had prepared for them. They're splitting up, Michael observed, just like you said they would. Rose was already moving, ghost-like through the storm. Fear makes men predictable. When faced with danger from above, they'll seek solid cover below. Marshal Torres's voice crackled through the wind. Ready when you are. The next phase began with another single shot from Rose, this one striking a concealed cache of mining charges near one of the Gatling gun positions. The explosion wasn't large, but in the swirling snow it seemed massive. More importantly, it sprayed frozen debris across the snow, creating a wall of ice crystals that further reduced visibility. Henderson's men, already nervous, began firing wildly at shadows. The Gatling guns roared again, but in the chaos and limited visibility, their explosive shells might as well have been fireworks, all sound and fury, signifying nothing. Meanwhile, Rose's carefully placed townspeople began their part, firing from multiple positions, creating the illusion of a much larger force. Sarah, watching from the church tower, finally understood the full scope of Rose's plan. You're using their own weapons against them, she realized. The snow, the explosives, even the terror of the Gatling guns. Every weapon has 2 edges, Rose replied, moving to a new position with fluid grace. A Gatling gun is fearsome when you can see your target. In a snowstorm, with careful preparation, she gestured at the chaos below. It becomes a source of fear for those using it. The battle reached its crescendo as Henderson's ammunition teams, desperate to resupply their guns, found themselves caught in Rose's invisible maze. Paths that seemed to lead to the guns actually circled back, bringing them under fire from their own explosive shells. Through it all, Rose moved like her old namesake, a ghost in the storm, appearing and disappearing, each shot precise and purposeful. She never aimed to kill, but each bullet drove Henderson's men exactly where she wanted them. The turning point came when one of the Gatling gun crews, thoroughly lost and panicked, sought shelter in what appeared to be a stable. Too late, they realized it was one of Rose's carefully prepared positions, and they had just trapped themselves with their own explosive shells. Surrender now, Rose's voice carried through the storm, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. You're surrounded, your weapons are useless, and that stable you're hiding in, the support beam above your heads is rigged to collapse. One shot is all it would take. Henderson's rage cut through the howling wind. Show yourself, you coward! Face me like a woman! A woman? Rose's voice held something cold. Men like you understand only one thing: power. So I'm showing you a different kind of power. Not the power to destroy, but the power to control. Every move you've made since entering this valley has been exactly what I wanted. Every position you've taken, every shell you've fired, all part of a plan months in the making. As if to prove her point, another series of controlled avalanches cut off Henderson's escape routes. His men were now completely boxed in, caught in a trap so subtle they hadn't even realized it was closing until too late. The end, when it came, was surprisingly quiet. No dramatic final shootout, no heroic charges, just the gradual realization by Henderson's men that they were utterly outmaneuvered, caught in a web of somebody else's design. But Rose wasn't done. She had one final lesson to teach about the true nature of power and justice, a lesson that would ensure Salvation Valley's peace for generations to come. As the morning sun finally broke through the storm clouds, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and crimson, Rose approached the trapped Henderson with an unexpected proposal. "You have a choice," Rose said, her voice carrying across the pristine morning air. "One that's more generous than you offered others." She stood before Henderson, her Colt holstered but ready. "You can face territorial justice for your crimes. And believe me, we have enough witnesses now to ensure that happens. Or you can become something more valuable, a messenger." Henderson, his black duster now stained white with snow and defeat, sneered. "A messenger of what?" "Of consequence," Rose replied simply. "The truth about what really happened here. Not just about how one gunfighter outmaneuvered your entire force, but about how one community stood together and proved that all your fancy weapons, all your explosive shells, mean nothing against people who know how to think, how to prepare, how to stand their ground." Sarah, watching from nearby, saw something she'd never expected. Rose was offering not just mercy but purpose. She wasn't just ending a fight. She was transforming an enemy into a tool for peace. "Why should I carry your message?" Henderson demanded, though there was something different in his voice now, something almost like respect. "Because you're a student of power," Rose answered. "You've built your reputation on understanding strength. So tell me, what's more powerful, the fact that I could have killed you and your men a dozen times over, or the fact that I chose not to? Your Gatling. Guns that now lie useless in the snow, or the strategy that made them worthless?" She gestured at the valley around them, at the intricate network of preparations that had turned a superior force's strength against itself. "You came here expecting to find one gunfighter, one woman to defeat. Instead, you found an entire community that had learned to think like a gunfighter, to use patience, preparation, and precision instead of brute force." As if to emphasize her point, the townspeople were already emerging, not with vengeful anger, but with the quiet confidence of those who had learned their own strength. They began dismantling Rose's elaborate constructions, repurposing the materials for rebuilding and growth. "Your reputation will actually help spread the message," Rose continued. "When the notorious Black Hand Henderson tells others about how his Gatling guns and explosive shells were defeated, not by superior firepower, but by superior thinking, well, that's the kind of story that makes men stop and reconsider their choices." Michael, now standing proudly beside his grandmother, understood what Rose was doing. "You're not just protecting Salvation Valley anymore, are you? You're teaching others how to protect themselves." Rose smiled at the boy's insight. "The best victory isn't the one that leaves your enemy destroyed, but transformed, changed in a way that helps others change too." In the days that followed, Henderson did indeed become a messenger, though not in the way anyone expected. He stayed in Salvation Valley not as a prisoner, but as a student. Rose taught him not just about gunfighting and strategy, but about the deeper principles that had transformed a simple valley into something extraordinary. "Power isn't just about who has the biggest guns," Rose explained one evening, as they surveyed the valley from her porch. "It's about understanding the terrain, both the physical landscape and the landscape of human nature. It's about knowing when to shoot, and when to grow something instead. The spring that followed brought more than just new crops to Salvation Valley. It brought visitors, lawmen, community leaders, and yes, even reformed outlaws, all coming to learn from the place where one of the territory's most feared forces had been defeated, not by violence, but by patience and preparation. Rose's farm became a different kind of school, though not one that taught traditional subjects. She taught principles, how to read terrain, how to prepare ground, how to build community defenses that didn't rely solely on guns. But most importantly, she taught people how to think like protectors rather than predators. Sarah, watching all this unfold, finally asked her the question that had been on her mind since the beginning. You never intended to just save one valley, did you? Rose looked out over her flourishing fields, where wheat grew in patterns that could still serve as defensive positions if needed, but now primarily yielded bread for a growing community. During the Apache Wars, she said quietly, I learned that a gunfighter's greatest skill isn't speed with a gun. It's the ability to see patterns, to understand how small changes can have large effects. I realized the same principle could be applied to fighting evil. Sometimes the best way to stop violence isn't with more violence, but by teaching people how to make violence ineffective. As spring painted Salvation Valley in shades of green and gold, word of what had happened there spread across the territory like wildfire in dry grass. The story grew with each telling, how the legendary swift-hand Rose had turned a simple farm into an invisible fortress, how she'd defeated 2 Gatling guns with nothing but patience and planning, how she'd transformed one of the territory's most notorious outlaws into a teacher of peace. But change, like the desert flowers that bloomed after rain, often draws unexpected attention. The morning trouble rode back into the valley and started peacefully enough. Rose was teaching Michael the finer points of reading terrain, how to spot natural defensive positions, how to understand the way wind and weather could work for or against you. When Marshal Torres rode up fast, kicking up dust from the newly thawed ground. Riders coming, he announced, without preamble. But not the usual sort. Army officers, looks like Major James Whitfield, and a full company of cavalry. Rose's reaction was subtle, just a slight pause in her movements. But Sarah, who'd come to know her tells, caught it. You know them? Know of them, Rose replied, her voice carrying that careful neutrality that meant trouble. Whitfield was at Fort Davis during the Apache Wars, man who believes that peace comes only from having the biggest guns and the most men to use them. Why? Would the Army take interest in us now? Michael asked, eager to apply his newly learned skills of reading situations. Rose smiled grimly. Because, son, we've done something more dangerous than beating a few outlaws. We've shown there's another way to handle trouble. Some folks find that more threatening than any gunfighter. Major Whitfield rode into town like he owned it, straight-backed. On a gleaming black stallion, 50 cavalrymen at his back. His uniform was parade ground perfect, his brass buttons catching the morning sun. But it was his eyes that Sarah noticed, cold and calculating, measuring everything in terms of military advantage. Quite the operation you've got here, Whitfield announced, surveying the valley from his saddle. Word of what happened with Henderson's gang has reached all the way to Washington. They're very interested in how one woman managed to defeat 2 Gatling guns. He spoke the word woman like it tasted bitter. Rose, standing on her porch, simply nodded in greeting, every bit the humble agriculturist. No mystery to it, Major, she replied mildly. Good people working together, knowing their land. Nothing. That would interest Washington. Whitfield's smile didn't reach his eyes. Oh, but it does interest them, Miss Rose, or should I say Swift-Hand. The Army's been looking for you for quite some time. Your skills could be put to better use than growing. Wheat. The tension in the air thickened like storm clouds gathering. Sarah saw how Rose's hand stayed carefully away from her holstered Colt, how she maintained her relaxed posture even as her eyes marked every soldier's position. I appreciate the offer, Rose said, her voice still calm as summer rain. But my fighting days are done. These days I prefer to grow things. This isn't an offer, Swift Hand. This is a requisition of valuable military assets. You, your tactical knowledge, and these fascinating defensive arrangements you've created. The Army needs people who can train others in these techniques. Rose's smile remained pleasant, but something shifted in her stance. Subtle, almost invisible, but Sarah had seen it before. It was the same shift that had preceded her lightning-fast draw against Reeves. Seems to me, Rose replied carefully, that a person's skills belong to themselves, just like a farmer's crops belong to those who planted them. Whitfield's face hardened. These are uncertain times, Rose. The territory needs order, structure. We can't have every settlement taking the law into their own hands, creating their own militias. It sets a dangerous precedent. More dangerous than leaving good people helpless against predators. Rose's question hung in the air like gun smoke. The Army can handle any threats to legitimate settlements. Whitfield's voice carried the weight of official authority. We're establishing a new fort just south of here. All local defense matters will be handled through proper military channels. Rose studied the Major for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She chuckled. You still don't understand what really happened here, do you? This was never about fighting. It was about teaching people they don't need to live in fear, that with proper preparation and community spirit, they can protect themselves. That's exactly the kind of dangerous thinking we're here to address. Whitfield's hand rested meaningfully on his cavalry saber. The Army cannot allow civilians to establish their own power structures outside proper authority. Power structures? Rose's voice held genuine amusement now. Major, all we've done here is show people how to farm smart, how to work together, how to use what they have to protect what they love. If that threatens your authority, maybe you should question what kind of authority you're really defending. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of more riders, but these weren't soldiers. They were farmers, ranchers, townspeople from settlements all across the territory. At their head rode William Blackhand Henderson himself, transformed from the terror of the territory into something else entirely. Heard there might be trouble brewing, Henderson announced, dismounting easily. Thought we'd come see if our teacher needed any help with her lesson. Whitfield's face darkened as more riders appeared on every ridge surrounding the valley. These weren't armed gangs or military units. They were ordinary people carrying tools more often than guns, but moving with the same quiet confidence Rose had taught them. What is this? Whitfield demanded. This, Rose replied softly, is what real peace looks like, Major. Not enforced by guns or uniforms, but grown from the ground up. Every person here has learned that the strongest weapon isn't the one that kills best, but the one that protects most effectively. She gestured at her fields, where wheat grow in patterns that could serve as defensive positions, but primarily yielded bread. You see a dangerous precedent. I see hope taking root. You see power slipping away. I see it flowing to where it truly belongs, in the hands of good people who know how to use it wisely. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet valley. When the Reeves brothers came, we were helpless. When Henderson came with his Gatling guns, we were ready. Not because we had bigger guns or more fighters, but because Catherine taught us something more valuable than shooting. She taught us how to think, how to prepare, and how to stand together. Whitfield looked around at the gathering crowd, at the determined faces of people who had learned to protect themselves. Without losing their humanity, for the first time, uncertainty showed in his expression. Washington won't like this, he warned. They'll see it as a threat to established order. Then maybe, Rose suggested quietly, you should tell them a different story, not about a gunfighter, teaching people to fight, but about communities learning to prevent violence before it starts, about a new kind of peace, one that doesn't need forts or cavalry to maintain it. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the valley in the warm colors of promise. Rose stood on her porch watching as Major Whitfield and his cavalry rode south, their straight military lines somehow less impressive than when they'd arrived. But she wasn't watching them. She was watching the people of the valley, already returning to their work of building something stronger than any fort. "You know they'll be back," Sarah said, joining her on the porch. "Maybe not Whitfield, maybe not the army, but someone will always see what we've built here as a threat." Rose smiled, the same quiet smile that had greeted every challenge since she'd first arrived in Salvation Valley. "Of course they will. That's why we keep teaching, keep growing, keep showing that there's always a better way than force. Each person who learns these lessons becomes a seed planted in new soil." Michael, who had watched everything with his usual keen attention, finally spoke. "Is that why you really came here, Miss Rose? Not just to stop the outlaws, but to start something bigger?" Rose knelt down to his level, her eyes holding the wisdom that came from years of choosing to nurture rather than destroy. "Remember what I told you about farming, Michael? How the strongest plants aren't the ones that grow fastest, but the ones that put down the deepest roots. Well, the same is true of peace. It's not about winning fights. It's about making fighting unnecessary." She stood, looking out over the valley where her carefully tended crops were beginning to sprout. The Reeves brothers, Henderson, even the army, they all think power comes from the ability to destroy. But the real power, the kind that lasts, comes from the ability to grow something worth protecting. The years that followed would prove her right. Salvation Valley became more than just a safe haven. It became a symbol of what determined people could achieve when they chose to stand. Together, other communities sent their young people to learn from the woman who had traded her gun for a plow, who had shown that the fastest draw wasn't always the best defense. And if sometimes, on quiet evenings, visitors would catch Catherine Rose practicing her lightning-fast draw in the fading light, they understood it wasn't about keeping her skills sharp. It was a reminder that every person had a choice about how to use their talents, to destroy or to protect, to fight or to nurture, to stand alone or to help others grow strong. They say you can still find her there, in Salvation Valley, teaching new generations the art of growing peace in hard soil. Her gun hangs clean and ready on her wall, but it's her farming tools that show the most wear. Some say it's just another tale born in the heat of desert campfires, but those who've seen the valley, who've watched how it flourishes when others struggle, who've noticed how trouble seems to pass it by, they know the truth. They know about the woman who proved that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't the fastest gun, but the patience to plant seeds of change and the wisdom to help them grow. They know about Swift Hand Rose, who showed the territory that true strength isn't in how many you can defeat, but in how many you can teach to stand on their own. And in Salvation Valley, where the wheat grows in patterns that could still serve as defensive positions but now mainly feeds a thriving community, her legacy continues to grow, strong and deep as desert roots, reaching out to touch lives far beyond the valley's peaceful borders. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.